In the dark underbelly of 1920s Dusseldorf, a sinister figure emerged, striking terror into the hearts of its residents. Known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, this serial killer's insatiable thirst for blood led to a reign of terror like no other. Welcome to Claws and Crime Chronicles, where we dive deep into the dark and enigmatic world of true crime and mysteries. Join us as we descend into the chilling tale of Peter Kürten, a monster who left a trail of horror in his wake, earning his infamous title. Prepare to be captivated and horrified by the true story of a man who embodied the darkest of human desires. Kürten, the eldest of 13 children, was born into an impoverished and violent household in Mulheim am Rhein. He saw his drunken father frequently sexually assault his mother and sisters as a young child. The violent incidents in his own home roused Kürten's sadistic tendencies. By the time Kürten was 16, he began stealing and had left his house. He was about to start the first of 27 prison terms that would last him for 24 years. Initially, the offenses were minor, mostly including theft of food and clothing that frequently resulted in brief prison terms in Dusseldorf. Kürten started living with a mistreated masochistic prostitute twice his age after being released from prison in 1899. With the completion of his education, humans developed the innate sadistic urges that animals do not. On May 25, 1913, Kürten committed his first murder in the city of Cologne. He had been robbing public taverns and inns where the owners resided in apartments above the establishments throughout the spring. He was inspecting a Cologne inn on this particular occasion. He stated that he broke into a house in the Wolfstrasse, an inn and tavern owned by Peter Klein, and went up to the first floor. He found nothing worth stealing, but in the bed he saw a sleeping girl of about 10 years old. Kürten choked the girl and sexually assaulted her. He then proceeded to slit her throat. The girl had been Christine Klein. Otto Klein, the girl's uncle, came under obvious suspicion. Otto Klein threatened to do something that his brother would remember for the rest of his life after he requested for a loan the previous evening but was turned down. Otto Klein was accused of killing Christine, but the jury found him not guilty despite being somewhat convinced of it. Otto Klein was therefore rightfully exonerated. The period of up until 1921 was spent in prison, and his move to Altenburg and subsequent marriage, Kürten appears to have led a very regular and devout life. He was able to secure long-term employment in a factory, where he became quite involved in union circles. Several years of tranquility and decent behavior followed when he assumed his new identity as a political activist. In 1925, Peter made his way to Dusseldorf, where once more served as a stimulant for his propensity for crime. Kürten pleased that the sunset was blood red on my return, viewing this as a sign of his fate. He later observed Dusseldorf in the evening light. The violent streak appeared to have been subdued by 4 years of arson attacks and minor crimes, but these events turned out to be simply a prologue to the horrors that Dusseldorf would experience in 1929. The body of Rosa Oliger, an 8-year-old girl, was discovered under a hedge on February 9, 1929, alerting the Dusseldorf police to the horrors for the first time. 13 stab wounds were found on her corpse, and gasoline was used to try to burn her to death. 6 days prior, a man approached Frau Kuhn and repeatedly stabbed her while grabbing her lapels. The man shot Frau Kuhn 24 times before he fled. Kürten's cruel desire was still unquenched, and he had found a new sexual stimulant by going back to the places where he had committed his murders. 5 days after Rosa Oliger was killed, a 45-year-old mechanic called Scheer was discovered dead with 20 knife wounds, several of which were to the head, on a road in Flingern. The following day, Kürten returned to the location of his attack once more, and he even had the gall to talk to a detective there. Despite being suspicious, the policeman was undoubtedly unconcerned and spoke openly about the incident. Shortly after this string of attacks, a moron by the name of Strasberg was detained for strangling 2 ladies. Strasberg was unavoidably charged with the February attacks by the police, and for some reason that is still a mystery, he confessed to all the atrocities and was committed to a mental institution. The fact that this irrelevant criminal was detained for assaults so similar to the ones mentioned above made it impossible to identify the true killer. But in August, a string of stabbing and strangulation crimes alerted the authorities to the presence of a lunatic once more. He assaulted Maria Hahn, strangled her, and then brutally stabbed her on August 11th. On August 8th, Kürten had first met Hahn, whom he had referred to as a girl looking for marriage, and had planned to take her out on a date the following Sunday to Dusseldorf's Neanderthal neighborhood. Kürten brought Hahn into a meadow after spending many hours with her so he could kill her. Following the murder of Hahn, Kürten switched from using scissors to a knife in an apparent effort to persuade investigators that there were other perpetrators behind the crime wave. 3 people were stabbed on the evening of the 21st of the month in the western suburb of Lehrenfeld. All 3 of the unlucky victims were greeted with good evening before being stabbed repeatedly in the back and ribs. On the evening of August 23, 1929, hundreds of people were taking part in the annual fair in the historic village of Flieha as the sun was setting. 2 foster sisters, Louise Lenzen, 14, and Gertrude Hamaker, 5, left the fair at about 10:30 p.m. and began making their way home across the adjacent allotments. They were followed along a footpath by a shadow that appeared out of the trees as they were moving. The shadow stopped the kids and asked Louise if she would be so kind as to get him some cigarettes and to leave the little girl in his care. Louise rushed back in the direction of the fairground after taking the man's cash. The man silently took Gertrude into his arms, strangled her and slowly slit her throat with a knife. A short while later, Louise came back and was dragged off the sidewalk before being decapitated and strangled. The next afternoon, a man approached Gertrude Schult, a servant girl, and tried to convince her to engage in sexual activity. When she said, "I'd rather die," he replied, "Die then," and stabbed her. Fortunately, Gertrude lived and was able to provide a detailed description of her attacker, who turned out to be a pleasant-looking, unremarkable man in his 40s. By this point, Kürten had gone into sexual overdrive, and the escalating number and severity of the attacks convinced the vampire's doctors that he no longer had any control over his cruel urges. In September, a young girl by the name of Ida Reuter was assaulted and killed, and on October 12th, another servant girl by the name of Elizabeth Dorier was also murdered. Then, on October 25th, attacks with hammers were made against Frau Müller and Frau Wanders. As the death toll grew, Dusseldorf was plunged into a panic akin to that brought on by Jack the Ripper. 5-year-old Gertrude Albermann vanished on November 7th. 2 days later, the newspaper Freedom received a letter with a map indicating the location of the child's remains beside a factory wall. The body was really discovered where the murderer had claimed, amidst a pile of bricks and debris. She had been stabbed 35 times and strangled 25 times. A steady stream of hammer and strangulation attacks occurred between February and May of 1930, however none were deadly. Despite the massive manhunt that was currently underway, the murderer had still not been found, and Dusseldorf was at breaking point. Even if the intentions might have been similar, the elusive Kürten's methods were always evolving, making it impossible for the investigators conducting the investigation to identify a consistent pattern. Dusseldorf was engulfed in complete horror by May 1930, and the vampire was still at large. As is always the case with serial murder, the perpetrator was apprehended nearly by accident. An unemployed domestic worker named Maria Budlik left the cathedral city of Köln on May 14 in search of employment in the nearby city of Dusseldorf. A man approached her on the platform at Dusseldorf station and offered to show her the route to a girls' hostel. After a while of following the well-lit streets, she suddenly remembered the media accounts of the murderer and refused to go any farther when he started pointing her in the direction of the park. The man persisted, and as they were having a disagreement, another man came over and asked if everything was okay. The man from the train station quickly fled after seeing the arrival of the stranger, leaving Fräulein Budlik and her savior, who was none other than Peter Kürten, alone. She agreed to accompany him to his room on the Mettmannerstrasse, but she then abruptly changed her mind and asked him if he could find her a different place to stay. They took the tram to Weringerplatz, where they began their hike through the Grafenberger woods. At this point, Kürten requested if he could have Budlik and grabbed her by the neck with one hand. He believed that she would concur given the circumstances and that his assessment was accurate. Budlik had not put up any struggle when Kürten assaulted her, therefore he had no intention of killing her. Maria wrote about her experience in a letter she sent to Frau Bruckner on May 17. The letter's intended addressee never received it. It was opened by Frau Brugmann after being misdirected, and after taking one glimpse at the contents, she called the police. The following day, accompanied by two plainclothes policemen, Maria made her way to the apartment block on the Mettmannerstrasse where Kürten lived. Kürten was startled to see her but said nothing. The policemen made no attempt to apprehend him. They believed that they were investigating a straightforward accusation of assault and were there just to identify the possible culprit before beginning the process of gathering evidence against him. Peter Kürten was not yet a suspect in the murders, but he obviously thought otherwise, for later that day when he met his wife at the restaurant where she worked and confessed to her that he was the notorious vampire of Dusseldorf. Having a genuine affection for his wife, and aware that now he had been identified as a suspect it would only be a matter of time before he was arrested, he suggested that she arrange his capture and then claim the substantial reward on offer for his arrest. She eventually agreed. On May 24, 1930, she informed the police of her husband's confession and agreed with them to arrange a meeting with him that afternoon at St. Rochus Church. The police surrounded the church with armed men. When Kürten arrived at 3 p.m., 4 officers charged forward brandishing loaded revolvers. The man grinned and made no attempt to resist. He was taken into custody and charged with multiple murders, violent assault, rape, and theft. The Dusseldorf vampire's trial began on April 13, 1931, with charges of 9 murders and 7 attempted murders. To prevent his escape, a unique cage that was shoulder-high was constructed within the courtroom, and behind it, some of the gory Kürten Museum displays were set up. The killer had meticulously arranged the skulls of his victims and body parts that showed the wounds he had inflicted in a chronological order. Knives, rope, scissors, a hammer, numerous pieces of clothes, and a spade that he had used to bury a woman were all on display. It was a very horrible display. A unanimous judgment of guilty on all charges was reached by the jury in just 1.5 hours. Dr. Rose, the presiding judge, gave him the death penalty 9 times for 9 victims who died. Kürten conducted himself with dignity, did not contest the verdict, and made no pretense of regret. The Dusseldorf vampire was executed on July 2, 1932, at a guillotine set up in the Klingelputz prison's yard. On the way to the yard, Kürten revealed his final wish before dying: "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? He begged the jail psychiatrist. After enjoying this idea for a time, he said, that would be the pleasure to end all pleasures. As we bring this chilling chapter to a close, remember that even in the darkest corners of history, there are lessons to be learned. Peter Kürten's reign of terror may be over, but the mystery of what drives someone to become a monster remains. Join us next time as we delve into more tales of crime and the human psyche. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you dare, because in the world of true crime, the shadows never truly fade. Stay vigilant, and until next time, keep one eye open and your doors locked. Good night, and may your dreams be free of nightmares.